If by chance you happen to be a fan of postmodern philosophy, this may be the one video on this channel you want to watch, because today we're talking about the importance of your truth and why your truth and only your truth matters when it comes to creating your tabletop game. Let's kick off part 2 of Let's Make a Tabletop Game. And last time on this series, I left you with this image right here. What this is just a garbled mess of some scribbled down notes that I had for some of the initial play tests, which you saw last time for my tabletop game. And since then, that garbled mess of notes has become this notebook right here. So your next step, when you're kind of past the initial really good ideas down fast phase of your tabletop game design, you need to start thinking about formalizing things a little bit more, organizing stuff, and just making your whole reference easier to work with. So what I recommend is taking a notebook that's dedicated purely to this tabletop game and only to this game and start structuring things out. Now you're still not writing out complete rules. For example, I've just got notes here on how the character cards will be structured. If I go to the next page, I've got a section here talking about how cover in the game works. And it's not necessarily written for a random player to be able to play, but it's just got enough information. Sometimes I've got just simple lists of things, but it's enough information for me to know exactly how I want things to work when I'm play testing the game from this point on. Also, I've got a few examples scribbled down. They're very rough. Here's a movement example, because now that I'm kind of got an idea how movement works, I want to just get some more formal notes in the form of visual imagery that are going to be used later on when I write the final rules. So I know this is going to be the basis of one of the examples in the rule book. Now, one thing I want to point out with the layout here, you're going to notice there's a lot of empty space. So in between some of these sections, I might have at the very least one blank page. Some of them I have 2 blank pages. So if we go to the end of the basic firing section, more blank notes, all that kind of stuff. My assumption is at this point, I've still got a lot of changes to make, a lot of detailed notes to make, and therefore that's why I've left a lot of blank space in between each of the sections of the rules, because I'm assuming it's going to be filled up with something useful. One other thing that's important to start thinking about is how you're going to organize this rule book. I've got 2 things going on here to make it relatively easy to find what I'm looking for. So first, in the upper corner at the start page of each of the sections, I just have a number circled, because I've pretty much been adding these sections in as I essentially take these garbled notes that I had over here and translate them into something more formal. I create the section, give it a number. So they're not necessarily in any super logical order, but by assigning them a number now, I can reference them in other parts of the rule. So if I know that, okay, if I go to, like, where's my turn order thing, which I should know where that is. Well, okay. Here's the turn order section. It's section number 3. So in the turn order section here, I have movement is section 4, firearm attack, section 5, and so on. So I at least have a general idea of where I'd go about finding those particular sections if I need to reference them as I am playing through a playtest. Because the last thing you want to be doing, especially in a little bit here when you bring in external playtesters, is to be sitting down here trying to find details of your rules in your rule book that you have, trying to interpret things. You want those play tests to go as smooth as possible, so knowing where everything is, even if you don't have a final rule book, is very, very helpful. One more other important thing about how I laid out this rule book, you see that I've got a piece of blue tape here. A moment ago I kind of mentioned I was adding sections in as I translate them from my notes. So therefore, like I said, they're not in chronological order. This blue tape piece, if I open up to it, is essentially the starting point of this rule book notebook. I know here's the things for starting a game. Here's where some of the pre-steps that I'm figuring out. One's been added. It's section 8. I can jump to that section. And then I got a kind of number down here where the turn order begins, because I have the description of the turn order here, but I'm not currently pointing to section 3, which why don't I go ahead and add that quickly? So therefore, next time I'm playing the game, I know turn order is discussed over in section 3, and I can jump there and make the whole gameplay flow go pretty well. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some thoughts how you want to organize your rules going forward for play testing. Also at this point, I'm going to talk more about this in a future video because it is kind of a big thing. I am experimenting a little bit with my own custom components. You saw me last time during the play test. I was using a Caladagia upgrade card here as like the movement tool for moving the guys across the board. But I've since designed a very simple 3D printed tool. It's not super obvious how to use it because it's super simple right now, but I've got 3 different movement speeds relative to the game now, so therefore I can use this instead of just some random game piece laying around. I can start customizing my things a little bit. But before you go too far down the custom route, you really got to think about what components are practical for you based on your budget, but we'll get into details of that in the not too distant future. But just as a general rule, keeping things simpler and more standard is going to cost less money. Standard card sizes like this, or for example, I have my Battletech Alpha Strike card that I actually use to focus my camera sitting here. But even a card like this, these guys have some sort of fancy coating on them that allow you to use a dry erase marker. That's a little bit fancier stuff that you're probably not going to get in a limited production run game unless you really want to pay out the nose. So that'll give you some ideas here how to start with the organization of your game's rules for play testing. But ultimately, the hardest decisions are going to be deciding what to keep in your game and what to get rid of. And we'll talk about that in just a moment because it ties in with that whole postmodern joke about your truth mattering. But before we get to that, I want to take a look at, I got some shameless self-promotion for you in the form of some upcoming gaming miniatures from my Fractured Colony miniature line over at fracturedcolony.com. You've probably seen these guys sitting behind me here. Here is one of the existing miniatures, the Griffin Hover Tank. And not too far in the future, this is going to be one of the new ones, the Avalon Self-Powered Artillery, as well as this little guy here, which is the Lionel class attack drone. So if you're interested in those kind of things, check out fracturedcolony.com. And those 2 new guys I just showed off there, well, they're going to be part of a Kickstarter launching not too far in the future. Oh, and there's one more vehicle in that set that I can show you the 3D models of right now. And this guy right here is going to be the 3rd one in the next Kickstarter, which would be the Pitbull main battle tank. So how does all these jokes about your truth apply to game development? Well, when you're creating a tabletop game, you're effectively creating a world. And if you've got, a bunch of story to go with it, you're creating an entire universe and characters and all that fun stuff to go along with your tabletop game. And what you really want to do is before you get too far down the playtesting route, maybe even before, I don't know, I'd say probably once you get past the scribble notes phase that you saw at the start of the video here, you need to really define what setting you actually have and really define your game in a somewhat detailed way. But this is not defining it in terms of rules as we've been doing up to this point. It's kind of defining it in a paragraph or 2 of just native language, just so that you have a source of truth as to what your game is going to be. So things like, what is your setting? Is it a historical game? Is it a sci-fi, fantasy? What is the scale of the game? Is it a army scale game? Is it a warband game? Maybe you're not fighting anything at all. Maybe you're trading gold coins for some weird reason because you're actually making a Euro game. How detailed is this game? Is it going to be an abstract game versus a simulation? If you're obviously trying to create a super hardcore simulation of an American Civil War battle, that's going to be a very different approach to what rules you keep and what you don't versus trying to create, like Warhammer 40,000 or something where you kind of can do whatever the heck you want. What are the unique features that'll really make this game stand out? There's a lot of similarity between tabletop games because at the end of the day, you're moving stuff around the tabletop, doing some sort of random events to resolve random things. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what are the key things that when someone asks you what makes your game cool, what are you going to tell them? Joking about how you're not Games Workshop is not a good answer, though it may seem kind of funny. So you really need a handful of good answers to this question because it's kind of like that whole 30-second elevator sales pitch that people like to talk about. And finally, who is your audience? I know people like to say, create the game you want to create and people will play it. And there is some truth to that. If you create the game you want to create, I'm sure you'll find people who want to play it. That doesn't mean you're going to make a lot of money doing it that way. So if you actually want to try to run a successful business, you have to have a game that is marketable to a decent audience who's going to hand over enough money to you to make things sustainable. So keep in mind, once again, are you trying to cater to that historical simulation guy who loves playing super detailed discussion of super detailed miniatures and tactics and hardcore rules, talking about whether the South could have won the Civil War or not? Or are you trying to cater more to that hardcore tournament audience who really wants games to be set in a very certain way and they're only going to be played a certain way all the time? Or are you trying more sort of somewhere in the middle where you can have some free form with cool scenarios and all sorts of weird stuff happening? So for me, let me answer each of these questions to wrap things up. What is the setting of my game? Well, this one, of course, is going to be Legends of Caladasia, which is not only science fiction, but by virtue of being in the Caladasia universe, I've got even more restrictions I've placed on myself in terms of how the characters can act, what weapons are around, what technology, all that fun stuff, because it is the sci-fi universe that I created, and I want things to be consistent. What is the scale of the game? I'm going to go for what I call a fire team scale. So you're talking like 3 to 6 characters per side for the time being. Relatively small scale game. How detailed is this game? This is definitely more of an abstract game. I'm not trying to create a bit of a simulation of anything because once again it's science fiction, and creating simulations of science fiction, you can do it. Battletech's basically a simulation, but it's a game that takes a long time to play. I want more of a faster paced game that's probably going to cater a little bit more to the tournament audience, but we'll talk about that in a minute. What are the unique features of my game? So I've got 2 things that I'm going for, which is the activation system, which is the game's not going to be I move a bunch of guys, you move a bunch of guys back and forth, and it's not even going to have quote defined turns per se where your entire character set moves as a turn. You're going to be able to move characters essentially whenever you want. If you want to activate the same character 4 times in a row, you can. It's a bad idea. There's penalties there. But I'm going for a very non-standard turn activation system, as well as the cover mechanics. So I'm putting a huge emphasis on getting your guys in cover, staying in cover, and trying to basically take advantage of cover while exploiting the weaknesses in your opponent's strategy and trying to neutralize their cover advantages. There's definitely some Gears of War feeling going on with how I want this game to play out. As for my audience, it's pretty much people who like sci-fi tabletop miniatures games. It is kind of hard to break into that market. It didn't go super well with the initial Caladasia space combat games, but I'm attributing that more to being space combat. Don't make a space combat game, people. Seriously. It's a very tiny market. Unless you're Star Wars. If you have the Star Wars license, I'd say go to town, but that game did get canceled last year in 2024. So feel free to try it if you want to try it. But I'm trying to go for more of the people who like smaller scale, skirmish level, sci-fi, tabletop games, fantasy stuff. We'll see how that goes. How competitive is your game going to be? I am going to have a tournament mode. I think you kind of need to have that. Or at the very least, you need to have like a standard, quote, balanced, unquote, scenario for people to play. But I do want to create a whole bunch of scenarios that are a bit more flavorful in how they play out. They're going to be asymmetrical, and there may be multiple of them linking together to form an interesting campaign to determine a campaign winner overall, instead of figuring out who won each battle individually. Now that you have your source of truth defined, it can be used as an anchor point to help you answer the question of whether any given mechanic you come up with should remain in your game or not. You can basically take a look at that particular mechanic and simply ask, does it fit in this game that I'm trying to create? If it does, you may want to keep it. If the mechanic just doesn't make any sense with that game description you just wrote, you can go ahead and throw it out. Now, it's not going to be the only anchor point you use. Your source of truth is just one thing to consider. Things like budget, because making money and spending money is an important aspect of creating tabletop games, and especially if you want to run a successful business, you have to do that kind of a thing. And also there's going to be an evaluation process of does any given mechanic actually add to the game. But both of those topics are going to be fairly long discussions and are going to be part of their own videos later on in this series. All right, so with that all said, I ran my mouth for a while right there. And by the way, I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield, as well as the Kaladeshi Universe, and of course, Fractured Colony, because you heard plenty of that, over at fracturedcolony.com. Seriously, more of these guys coming out soon. If you want to learn more about tabletop game design, I'm going to drop these videos in every few weeks into my normal rotation of videos as I make progress on my game. And the next one is going to be talking a lot about components, like I said, standardized versus custom. So hit subscribe if you want to see that one in a few weeks. So thank you guys all for watching, and I'll see you next time.